Hey everybody, welcome to Mossback, the official podcast of the Mossback's Northwest video series from Cascade PBS. I'm Stephen Hegg.
And I'm Knute Berger.
And today, we're exploring the life and legacy of legendary architect Minoru Yamasaki, designer of the World Trade Center in New York and the Pacific Science Center in Seattle, among many other buildings.
I remember my mother, who didn't like modern architecture, loved this building.
His impact can still be felt in Seattle and in cities across the country and the world.
Controversial as Rainier Tower was, now it's a landmark.
If you haven't already seen the video, take a few moments to watch it. It'll make this conversation more interesting, more relevant, and you'll see many images of Yamasaki's buildings too. You can find the video in the show notes, but for now, let's lay the foundation.
It's fun to be part of Seattle's history just looking out the window.
Knute, the Rainier Tower, designed by Yamasaki, is one of the iconic buildings in Seattle 47 years after it was built. Everybody has an opinion about it.
This building that's thrust out of the earth on this point, and it's become so well known and so controversial.
We took an excursion there one wonderful afternoon, and it still stands up. What is your opinion of the Rainier Tower?
Well, I'm so used to it. But I remember at the time it went up, I was moving back to Seattle from having been away at college during the time it was being built. And in my impression, Seattle had changed a lot from the late 60s to the mid 70s. Coming back to Seattle in the 70s, it seemed like it had gained a lot of life and activity and newness. It just felt like a more urban city instead of that sleepy port town we remember. And here was this skyscraper on a pedestal standing right in the middle of downtown. I remember when it was going up, it was sort of like, is that going to hold like a bridge up or something? I mean, it was just kind of like a weird
Pedestal sink.
It's a bird bath.
It's a huge bird bath, yeah.
And, you know, it was controversial when it went up. I mean, there were a lot of critics didn't like it. They didn't like that it was built at all. They didn't like the design. But there were a lot of other people, and I think I was one of them, who just sort of looked up and thought, wow, that is really cool. You know, it was kind of flamboyant in a city that's particularly non-flamboyant. I mean, the Space Needle was like an outlier, but...
Rainier Tower was designed and built towards the end of Yamasaki's career. He had done so many other things, including the Pacific Science Center, World Trade Center. But what was Yamasaki's early life like? He was born and raised in Seattle, right?
Yes, he was Seattle born and raised, lived in Japantown. His family did not have much money. He had an uncle who was an architect and was introduced to him and shown some architectural designs and plans. And he just clicked. He's like, ooh, I want to do that. He went to Seattle Public Schools and went to the University of Washington. He was a student along with Victor Steinbrück and Perry Johansson and other people who became prominent in the architectural community here, and graduated in 1934 and went back to New York to make a career in architecture in, you know, the biggest city in the country. Had lots of projects going even in the Depression.
How do you think his upbringing affected or influenced his work?
I think it had a lot of influence in different ways. So to put himself through school when he was at the UW, he worked in salmon canneries in Alaska.
The interior of the cannery is an example of modern high-speed production methods.
And, of course, there, the work in the canneries was strictly segregated by racial or ethnic groups. White people did certain jobs. Indigenous people did certain jobs, Asian people did certain jobs, that kind of thing. He hated it up there. The working hours were just brutal. The conditions were dirty, unsanitary, and it enraged him. I mean, he worked there, but he hated it.
The machine removes the 6 fins, splits the body, and eliminates the viscera.
Students at the architecture school called him Sockeye, was his nickname. And growing up in Seattle and being of Japanese ancestry, he suffered from prejudice. And a lot of it he suffered up in Alaska, but he faced it here in Seattle at school and in other ways. And so one of the things his cannery experience, he said later, was he just realized that in being an architect, what he wanted to do was design buildings, working spaces that were uplifting. He says repeatedly, he talks about serenity. He wanted his architecture to embrace serenity. American society was too mechanical, too complicated. And so he's looking for architecture that brings, and these buildings do that. You can see that in his work.
So he's in New York. He gets his start in New York. Is he in New York at the start of World War II?
Yes, he is.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii by air, President Roosevelt has just announced.
And he worked in a number of kind of, projects in New York. He worked for a firm that was doing design for the New York World's Fair, 1939. And at the time the war broke out, he had just gotten married to a Japanese woman. And he was actually working for an architecture firm that was building military bases, U.S. air bases in Newfoundland. So preparing for the war. And this was a very frustrating experience for him because he immediately became suspect as Japanese. What is a Japanese man doing working on these military bases? Fortunately, his architecture firm went to bat for him and said, no, he's a good guy, and he was able to keep his job.
And he avoided being on the East Coast. He avoided being incarcerated like so many Japanese Americans on the West Coast.
When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, our West Coast became a potential combat zone. Living in that zone were more than 100,000 persons of Japanese ancestry.
Yes, but the incarceration of Japanese on the West Coast affected his parents. And, he was outraged by the incarceration. It was a terribly traumatic experience for him, for his parents. He was able to bring his parents east, and they lived in a small apartment with him and his wife. And he threw himself into work helping other displaced Japanese Americans find homes. There were other people who moved out of the area in order to avoid internment, and he attempted to assist them. So he was very involved at that level in it.
Modern American architecture has a boldness.
What was the big picture in America as it regards architecture and design in the 1950s? What was the sensibility? What were the conflicts?
The look of America expressed in materials old and new.
Well, this is when you're getting into the sort of mid-century modern period. And the Northwest had a particular part of that which largely reflected itself in single-family homes.
It is now possible to have the individual styling every family wants in its home and still have all the benefits of mass production.
Fabulous glass and Asian influence and that kind of thing, and beautiful use of woods.
The family at home is enjoying the convenience and the functional beauty of walls of glass.
Yamasaki had moved to Detroit and opened his own firm. He was really interested in fulfilling this dream of creating workspaces, offices, campus buildings that were just kind of more aspirational. There's an article here from the 1950s in which he's talking about his philosophy. Architecture must satisfy the needs for order, shelter, and commodity or function, said Yamasaki. it must also fulfill society's aspirations. It's reaching for nobility. It's craving for beauty. This is the philosophy born out of the salmon canneries. This is what his idea was. I think the key sentence there is craving for beauty. Yamasaki saw modern society as chaotic, as mechanistic. And he was trying to bring some sense of grace back into architecture. Modern architecture, if you're talking about skyscrapers, you're talking about buildings, they tended to be steel and glass. They tended to be they were unadorned. The idea was simple, elegant, and many people found it as cold.
How did Yamasaki bring that philosophy, that sensibility to the impulse to tear everything down and replace it with big cubist boxes?
Well, I think he saw the buildings that he was building. And if you look at whether it's Rainier Square or whether it's the IBM building or whether it's the World Trade Center, you see narrow vertical lines. It may be boxy, but it's very clean. You're using often materials that are white, something that gives it an airiness. The use of the Gothic arch motif, he felt, I think, gave it some sense of class. And he was also really focused on things like water features, fountains, green areas. And of course, he'd seen this as he traveled around in India or in Japan, how you could create serenity even while you had a large office building. And the prime example was the U.S. Science Pavilion at the 1962 Seattle World's Fair, which is now the Pacific Science Center.
The longer you look at the architecture of the U.S. Science Pavilion at the World's Fair, the more fascinating it becomes. And every time you move to a new vantage point, you get a new perspective.
Which truly is elegant, I think. I think from a distance or even up close, the arches, the water features, the smaller contours.
The open arches that dominate the area present a lacy effect at the top. In them, you can almost see the crystal structure of a snowflake. But they, like the buildings, are made of precast concrete.
Yeah, and to me, that building is sort of Yamasaki at the height of his idealism, at the height of his putting these theories together. You have the fountains and water features. You have these Gothic arches, which have no structural intent. They're not holding anything up. They're been removed from the cathedral and put in this space. And then you have this series of buildings around it that are connected, which is where the science exhibits are. And then there was a space where you could actually kind of look out at Puget Sound. He built a kind of cloister, or some people compared it to a modern Alhambra. And it was the thing that made Yamasaki famous.
The Science Pavilion was designed by Minoru Yamasaki, who used to live in Seattle.
He was well known in architecture for projects he'd done in St. Louis and Detroit and other places. The Science Center got him on the cover of Time magazine. It got him the commission for the World Trade Center. The guys who were planning the World Trade Center came out to Seattle to see the fair and, walked into the Pacific Science Center and said, wow, modern architecture doesn't have to be cold. It doesn't have to be severe. It doesn't have to be, as it later became, brutal, these almost bunker-like concrete structures.
Was Yamasaki bucking trends and completely innovative, or was he doing his own version of a trend itself?
I think he was bucking trends. He was trying to add decoration back into modern architecture. This was how the high priests of modern architecture regarded him, as what one called his work a twittering aviary. These things weren't stripped down enough. So he was bucking that trend. On the other hand, it came at a moment in modern architecture where some architects and their critics were beginning to look at it and say, ooh, here's a guy with a fresh take. here's somebody who's staying within the general bounds, but is finding ways to make these things appealing.
The World Trade Center, unmistakable in its silhouette against the sky. Its twin towers of steel, glass, and concrete reach more than 1,360 feet in the air.
What most people don't know about the World Trade Center is what it looked like at its base, at its most human interaction. We're familiar with the Twin Towers, this huge beacon of commerce and construction. But what we don't remember, and what I don't know, is what it looked like at the base.
Yeah, well, and of course, by the time people were really paying attention, the base was destroyed because of 9/11.
Was there that Yamasaki elegance?
Yes, I mean, there were other buildings. There were water features, sculptures. I mean, there were things that were designed to make it a habitable sort of environment. The problem, I think, with the World Trade Center was scale. It was not decided when Yamasaki took the commission in 1962, and he was picked over some of the top modern architects of the day. It was not decided that the World Trade Center was going to be 2 large towers. But as they went through the project and were looking at what kind of floor space and leasable space they could get, they began to realize we need something that will really sell this. And the decision was made to make them the tallest buildings in the world.
From the World Trade Center observation deck, the highest in the city, the highest outdoor deck in the world.
And once they decided to do that, they put the whole project on a scale that in some ways almost made it impossible, I think, for Yamasaki to mitigate that. In other words, they were so dominant, they were so huge, the size was the focus that, like you say, the ground level for the casual observer was erased.
That must be the conflict for most architects who design these kinds of buildings. You have the developer that wants ultimate space. It economically has to succeed, and yet the architect has a vision that conflicts.
I mean, the project was really difficult. He almost quit more than once. And as you say, the commercial requirements and the PR requirements, frankly, I think were very difficult for him to completely reconcile. On the other hand, he had a type of design and worked with a Seattle engineering firm that had developed this type of design that allowed them to do these kind of elegant, narrow-windowed, tall buildings that were structurally sound and created enough floor space that they were attractive to the clients. But I think he struggled with it. I think it was a real challenge for him.
On the street front on
the other side.
4th Avenue.
On 4th Avenue,
Yeah.
I remember that.
Let's go back to Rainier Tower. It's interesting to actually walk by and be very close to Rainier Tower. One thing that I felt was just sort of the enormous canopy of that pedestal once you get close to it.
Stand almost under the arch of this pedestal.
Right.
I mean, I kind of seem vulnerable even.
You know, I think there are people who felt that the pedestal base was kind of unworthy of Yamasaki given his other work. And I think at the time, too, there were people who worried that
it would tip over?
It would, yes, exactly. And apparently people still worry about that.
I work a catty corner across the street that was designed by the same architect, but you can see the same kind of arched forms. I was always worried that our building is shorter than the Rainier Tower, so if it ever tipped over, it would pound us into the ground like a nail. But I'm told this is a very stable building by some geotech experts that work in here. So
we talked to a man who has an office in the IBM building and, is afraid that someday it'll tip over. Of course, it survived a major earthquake in 2000. But I think that precariousness was seen as a kind of gimmick by architectural critics. So Ada Louise Huxtable, who was the Pulitzer Prize-winning architecture critic at the New York Times called it a dreadful mistake aesthetically, with a cornball try for novelty that puts a tower on a curved tapered base for a popsicle effect.
Oh, I never thought of popsicle. I keep going back to pencil.
I've always thought it looked like an architect's pencil just jammed into the ground. Like, hey, I'm done designing.
I could never separate the actual tower, pedestal and all, from the rest of the development on the block. So I saw a 3-story dark mall in the middle of the city, which I thought was so bizarre next to what was a radical design.
There was a lot of criticism that echoes what you're saying at the time it was built. There were questions that were raised about, if you're trying to build something that has real urban function, why are you putting the shops underground, essentially? Why are you building a mall and you're burying all that instead of having street-level retail?
He built this at the time when the downtown business community wanted to revitalize downtown, and their view was malls.
There were also people like Victor Steinbrueck and others who really objected to the demolition of historic structures in what we call the Metropolitan Tract, which is the University of Washington-owned land grant properties downtown. And there were historic buildings that were torn down, and this happened right after people had saved the Pike Place Market.
But a group of concerned citizens led by architect Victor Steinbrueck mounted a campaign to save the market.
They had created the Pioneer Square, Skid Road Historic District. And people were like, we're saving these buildings. What are you doing, tearing it down for a mall? So there was a lot of controversy about that particular development.
And it sits in the middle of a historic section. The Olympic Hotel is across the street. The Skinner Building's across the street. On the other side on 4th Avenue is the Cobb Building. All reek of history. And this is a complete difference.
Yes, and I think that was viewed certainly by Yamasaki as a positive. I think he thought that area was stale. He didn't think much of the Olympic Hotel block.
He thought this neighborhood needed, a radical remaking. We think of the Olympic Hotel as kind of this historic treasure. He didn't see that at all. It was like, I think you can do a lot better than this. And this building was, in a way, was sort of like, I can prove it to you, I mean, if he'd had a free hand, he really wanted a blank slate he could rework. Yamasaki was pretty ambivalent about historic preservation. That wasn't his thing. He had reasons to resent old Seattle, and with the World Trade Center, they tore down a whole bunch of historic buildings on Lower Manhattan to build that whole complex. I don't think he batted an eyelash at that, He was very focused on the idealism that he was putting into modern architecture.
If Yamasaki had had his way, he would have raised that entire neighborhood.
But now there is a new tower there called Rainier Square Tower, which has an interesting shape itself.
Yeah, when it was first proposed, the idea was maybe that Amazon was going to be the main occupant. They were going to lease the space, and it was kind of boot-shaped. And one reason was that people didn't want it to completely block the distinguishing feature of the old Rainier Tower, which was the pedestal. And so it was interesting. So many people were very critical of it when it was built. Yet nearly half a century later, people are like, no, you can't block that view. We need to see that.
This just seems to be a cycle that every city goes through about every 2 decades. Preserve the old or don't preserve the old. And then 20 years later, opinions reverse.
Views on modern architecture go in stages as well. So nowadays we kind of revere mid-century architecture, and people love these modern homes from the late 40s to the 1960s, early 70s, and buildings come in and out of fashion. The Smith Tower, all that white cladding That was part of a particular design era of early 20th century to make things look clean and modern and that kind of thing. Now, they have trouble renting it out. There was a time when Seattle, went to bat to save the Smith Tower. You wonder if the same people would be mobilized today in the same way. And if something's been around for 40 or 50 years in a city that's mostly newcomers, it becomes the tradition.
Becomes a relic.
Yeah. Like you say, it is interesting that something that people revile in one era come to believe is precious in another.
Yamasaki, when you read bios of him, he's often called one of the most important architects of the 20th century. Do you think that's true, and why do you think he's seen that way?
I think he is a very important figure. He's also a figure a lot of his buildings have been torn down. He had a notorious failure early on in a big public housing project that was built and then torn down fairly shortly thereafter. And, all great architects have a lot of buildings that get wrecked, the wrecking ball. I think that the Science Center continues to be one of the sort of gems. You think about the critique of Tom Wolfe, who wrote From Bauhaus to Our House, basically a savage critique of modern architecture, just saying, it's anti-people. It's, Yamasaki recognized its weaknesses, and he saw the appeal to our better nature. You talk about the angels of our better nature. That was who Yamasaki was trying to evoke. That was who he was trying to draw out of all of us involved in this kind of chaotic modern society. And he'd seen the worst of it in those salmon canneries. It was ugly, dirty, bloody, racist, everything. And he wanted to do better for humanity. And I think that is like an essential part. And, he wasn't a perfect person, but I think his idealism and his belief in the power of beauty and serenity is something we ought to pay attention to now.
Thanks for listening to Mossback. If you'd like to see all the episodes from this season of Mossback's Northwest, you can find them at cascadepbs.org. The video series is now in its 9th season. A new episode airs on Cascade PBS every Thursday night through May. This episode of Mossback was produced by Sarah Bernard. Our story editor and executive producer is Sarah Menzies. You can subscribe to the Mossback podcast wherever you listen. And whatever platform you're listening on, please review us. We'd love to know what you think of the show. And check out the show notes if you want to get in touch. Also, if you'd like to support the work we do, whether it's our lineup of podcasts, the video docuseries we stream every week, or the in-depth reporting we deliver every day, go to cascadepbs.org. In addition to supporting our journalism, members receive complete access to the on-demand programming of Cascade PBS. And being a member means you can sign up for an exclusive weekly Mossback Den newsletter from Knute Berger, where he offers greater insight into his latest historical discoveries. Mossback is a product of Cascade PBS. I'm Stephen Hegg. We'll be back soon with another episode.